Hi everyone, I'm your host Kirsty and welcome to this audiobook podcast where each week I read you a chapter from my memoir, Gotta Glitter. This week we are reading chapter 14, There's a Starman Waiting in the Sky. This is a lyric taken from a David Bowie song called Starman, and this song, my dad didn't listen to music. I mean, Gregorian chant was his favorite style. And even then, it just wasn't his jam. But he did love this song. And I think that's because he was an astronomer. He related to the starman in the sky. And I think also feeling like a little bit of a oddball or an outsider a lot of his life. And he just really resonated with this song. It was pretty beautiful growing up with my dad, actually. He, it was often strange and it could be irritating. And sometimes I'd be tearing my hair out. But there'd be other times where he would get us up at 4 o'clock in the morning and he'd have his telescope all set up to show us something beautiful happening in the sky that wasn't going to happen for another 100 years or in our lifetime. And it was pretty magical. So this is a little tribute to my dad.
Didn't know what time it was, the lights were low, I leaned back on my radio, some cat was laying down some rock and roll, not a soul said. Then the loud sound it seemed to fade, came back like a slow voice on a wave of fade. That was no DJ, that was hazy cosmic jive. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He'd like to come and meet us, but he thinks he'd blow our minds. There's a starman waiting in the sky. He's told us not to blow it, 'cause he knows it's all worthwhile. He told me, let the children use it, let the children use it, let all the children do get.
Chapter 14, There's a Starman Waiting in the Sky. Soundtrack, David Bowie, Starman. Mum arrived home from Toronto. When she got to the hospital, she found me yelling profanities at my psychiatrist. How can you think about sending me home? I just told you how I'm going to fucking off myself. What is wrong with you? I want another psych. Can I get another psych or what? He wanted to send me home on the proviso that Mum could be on suicide watch. I didn't want to leave and was furious at the suggestion. Does he think I'm okay? Is this what okay looks like? In the hospital, I felt the same all-consuming heartache I did on the outside, but I knew I was safe. I knew I wouldn't die here, and I couldn't be sure of that anywhere else. His advice felt like another rejection. I couldn't keep a man, I didn't have any friends, and now I was being asked to leave the hospital that I paid the best part of $3,000 to put up with me. Was I that bad? I couldn't be the worst person they've had through these doors. I was being treated like an unruly teen on Dr. Phil. Well, in that case, cash me outside, how about that? I stayed for a few more days, mostly out of spite, before finally heading home. Mum's return had disrupted several plans. She had been in Toronto to spend time with her mum, who, being 101, she was unlikely to see again. If she was torn about which terminal patient to choose, she hid it well. I would have loved to be big enough to tell her to stay and be with her elderly mother. But the truth is, I needed her more than I've ever needed anyone. My parents had also arranged their first ever holiday sans kids in 30 years. Dad had handed in his resignation from his job in the UAE because he felt the work environment was driven by threats and manipulation. So the Rents had decided to meet up in Portugal for a 2-week adventure before Dad returned to Melbourne. When I got sick, Mum came home, leaving Dad to holiday alone. This wasn't unusual for them. In fact, my parents travelled alone so often that my grandma would continually ask Mum how her ex-husband Philip was. Such a kind man. He still visits me despite your divorce. To which Mum would reply and remind her that they were still together and she was just fiercely independent and didn't feel the need to follow her husband everywhere he went. Grandma did not believe her. I emailed Dad from the hospital to let him know where I was. Despite his own battles with bipolar, I had no idea how he would respond to my being in a psych ward. He simply replied, "If you had a broken bone, you would be in hospital treating that, wouldn't you?" I see no difference. Stay as long as you need, Kay. Rest up. When I arrived home, I was still a wreck. But I had Mum, and that alone was nothing short of life-saving. Between myself, Mum, and one remaining feline, there was life in the house again. Mum would try to distract me by playing TV programs I used to enjoy. I realised I would have to rediscover an entirely new set of interests, because the music and TV shows of my past were now tainted. I stopped listening to music entirely. I couldn't even watch MasterChef without bursting into tears, remembering Simon making his daft impressions of George Calombaris. It's just so... searches for word... yummy. Have you ever watched an amateur chef plate up slow-cooked beef cheeks with cauliflower puree and started to cry? Or heard Kesha on the radio singing about brushing her teeth with a bottle of Jack and wanted to die? Because I have. A lot. I had asked Mum to help me with my rampant pill addiction by giving her control of my pain medication. Opioid addiction is tricky because you genuinely need the drug for your pain, but have zero control once it's in your possession. Imagine if an alcoholic broke their leg and the cure was to drink 1 sip of alcohol 4 times a day until it healed. Yeah, not gonna work. The other quirk of opioids is that they are incredibly effective in the short term, but long-term use can actually increase pain. Your body becomes so reliant on the drug that it begins to create pain and sensitivities in order to encourage you to take more. An addiction specialist framed it to me like this. When you are dehydrated, it's not one part of your body that is thirsty. Every cell of your body is signaling to your brain that you need water. For the rest of your life, your entire body will crave this drug like water. Ah, good. And I thought, my brain, heart, and body would all call for the pills. Crazed, I would scrounge through Mum's drawers and pockets of her clothing to find her ever-changing hiding spots. I watched myself sneak around and felt disgusting. But I knew as soon as that pill was in my system, all my guilt would melt away. This was when I started to really feel like a junkie. But by then, I was in too deep and wouldn't have known how to stop had I wanted to. Which I didn't. I would have happily let those pills kill me. Even writing this now, my chest is warm and my mouth is salivating for one more taste. It was different to anorexia because I desperately wanted that to end. This addiction felt like my only saving grace.
Since arriving home from the hospital, I hadn't heard from Dad. He had missed his usual call for suicide watch, but Mum and I agreed he was probably having too much fun in Portugal and wasn't thinking about his phone. This was a man who only got a mobile under duress for work and barely knew how to use it. He was neither reliable with keeping his technology charged nor checking for Wi-Fi at hotels. In fact, he loved being off the grid. 2 weeks passed without hearing anything. He hadn't emailed, called, or been in touch with anyone else in the family. I had a low-grade sense of dread, and I could see Mum, too, was beginning to worry, which concerned me even more. I had hoped my grief was making me paranoid and her comfort would reassure me. Then the call came. I had been out for the evening and came home to find Mum talking quietly on the phone. It reminded me of being a kid and overhearing adults talking in that low, hushed tone that alerted you to something serious. Mum hung up the phone and let me know the person on the other end would be calling back soon with news. She looked at me, concerned but not crying. Mum cries at everything, I thought. That's good. That's a good sign. She spoke. Dad was meant to go back to work yesterday. He never showed. That was his colleague checking to see if we had heard from him. Although Dad had handed in his resignation, he still had loose ends to tie up before he returned home. They are sending someone to his apartment to check on him, she continued. I cuddled up to Mum on the sofa. We held each other. A few tense minutes later, the phone rang. We held our breath for the possibility of life-altering news. I couldn't hear the person on the other end, but I read the entire conversation on Mum's face. Listening attentively, shock, trying not to cry, tears, and heartbreak before she ended the call. Watching her restrained tableau, I understood. My dad was dead. My father was found in his bed, his suitcases packed for his morning flight to Portugal, which he had never made. We would learn of the taxi arriving to take him to the airport, the driver honking the horn and banging on the door. No answer. He drove off. Dad never made it to Portugal, meaning my wonderful, brilliant, strange and fascinating father was dead for 2 weeks before anyone went looking for him. How does that happen? He is suspected of having died the night before the holiday, but being unable to know for certain, his death certificate was roundabouted. An entire life of nearly 60 years on this rotating rock, and his final moments were an estimate. There's a lot of confusion surrounding the details of my dad's death. We were told he had a heart attack, which would be easy enough to explain by his epilepsy and stressful workload. But I'm not convinced. The number of conversations we had about his toxic work environment, how he didn't trust his boss, and how Dad was the only one privy to certain important issues made me uneasy. The company didn't want Dad to leave. He knew too much. And they still required his services. But he'd had enough of the bullying and corruption and wanted nothing more to do with it. He wanted out. Looking back on our conversations, I do think he was nervous about leaving. I wish I could remember the specifics of our conversations that made me feel so sure something was wrong. But I had just been diagnosed with bipolar and my head was a wreck with grief. I wasn't alone in my concerns. There were heated discussions around the dinner table between my paternal aunt and grandfather who, like me, were worried there could have been a motive to get rid of Dad. These were generally shot down by Mum rather quickly, probably because she didn't want Ben or me to think about anything untoward, and I'm sure as a form of self-preservation. I understand that need. I want to believe it was a heart attack. A swift, quick heart attack with minimal pain. I need to believe that. Because the alternative makes me sick. Years later, while cleaning the kitchen together, I would ask Mum, "Do you think something bad happened to Dad?" I fully expected her to be offended and blow me off, but instead, she took a deep breath, a long pause, and said, "Maybe." She told me that in the months following Dad's death, she had found copies of emails to his employment agent that began, "If anything happens to me, please make sure my wife gets everything." Was Dad being paranoid or responsible? It was generally a fine line with him. Losing 3 of the closest people to me in the space of 6 months bore a deeply complex grief. Like 100-year-old tree roots, it weaves and winds from one loss to the next. I cannot grieve my father with love in my heart, without a flood of rage rushing through me, recalling Simon's betrayal. I can't retrieve a happy memory of Sam without feeling the hole my father left behind. I carry guilt for being unable to grieve my beloved pets and elderly grandma, who passed away only a few months later, because I had reached full saturation by that stage. Even now, part of me is shut down to caring too much, building walls sky high to protect me. I have learned that it is not safe to love, because the loss hurts more than the memory of love could ever mend. This is a poem I wrote several years ago, dedicated to my father. It's called PJM, in the honour of his initials. And it's one of 2 poems included in the book. I run to him with arms outstretched. Through frenzied crowds I'd weave, lest he who gave me this life forgets his precious spark. Sometimes I get near close enough that one more step and I could touch, fling my arms round his large frame, restless heart be tamed. Light trickles through in another world, volume dies, I go unheard. Colours fade to sepia, don't leave your precious spark. Eyelids flicker to meet rude daylight. Perhaps he'll come again tonight. This time he'll stay long enough to hold this weary spark.
Thanks for listening. If you want more, check out the show notes and follow the link to my website or Linktree, where you can get your very own copy of the book in eBook or paperback. Join me on Instagram or listen to the Spotify playlist of all the theme songs from the book. Don't forget to subscribe to the pod so it downloads straight to your app each week. And if you like the show, why not share it with your mates? All right, see you guys. Bye.